Hi friends, and welcome to Agora Café. We're very honored to have you here today. And today we are going to engage with a friend of mine concerning concerning doubts that we all sometimes walk with in this sort of ongoing secular age that we live in. So my guest today with me is Dr. Mike Licona. Mike, it's really great to have you. Mike has actually been in our country at least 2 times when we got you. Probably 3 times if we really include the debate that you and Craig, William Lane Craig had with Saki Spannenberg and Hansi Wolmerans. But at least 2 times that we got you over here to South Africa. Mike is a world-renowned historian and also a prolific apologist for the Christian faith. And he has engaged in debates with Muslim apologists, Yusuf Ismail. He's been in debate with Abel Pinar and many other atheists and agnostics as well. So Mike, it's really an honor to have you on our show today. And maybe I could we could just start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself. Obviously the audience don't really know you. So who is Mike Licona, and what has your life been, what happened in your life the past few years, and what does your life actually look like in terms of what you do on a daily basis?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks, Rudolph, for having me on your show. I'm honored to be on it, and it's wonderful to reconnect with you. So, so I'm glad we're friends and have maintained our friendship over these years.
Sure.
So, I got interested in historical matters back in the mid-1980s. I was questioning my faith at the time. I was in grad school, and I believed I had a relationship with the Lord, but then it just dawned on me one day, well, people of other faiths believe that they have a relationship with God. How do I know that what I believe is true? And I had not been interested at all in Christian apologetics up until that point. And then when I started doubting my faith, well, then it became meaningful to me. One of my roommates referred me to Gary Habermas, who was a professor in the grad school there, but he was in the philosophy department. I was studying New Testament. And but I popped into his office, and he graciously gave me some time and pointed me to the resurrection of Jesus, that there's really good evidence for it. And so I devoted years to studying that. I did my master's thesis on it. I did my PhD dissertation on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. I've engaged in many debates with some of the world's leading critics on the matter of whether Jesus rose from the dead. More recently, I have spent several years studying the Gospels in terms of trying to understand why there are differences in the Gospels. Wrote a book, I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And also I'm studying, my research is on historical reliability. Now, I understand that there have been a number of good books that have been written. People like Craig Blomberg and Peter Williams have written books on the historical reliability of the Gospels, and they are very good books. But I'm coming at it from a little different angle. Those of us who study the New Testament understand that ancient literature isn't the same as modern literature. They went by some different rules. So I'm trying to understand what historical reliability meant in view of how ancient history and biography were written, and then apply that to the Gospels. So that's what I've been up to. Currently, right now, I'm writing a lay-level version, popular level version of my academic book on gospel differences. I hope to have that done by June of next year, and hopefully it'll be out sometime in 2022.
Okay, well, great. And we're going to get into both your books. As far as I know, you've written 2 books by now. The first one is on the resurrection of Jesus, which is a sort of I wouldn't say a popular version of your thesis, because it's still very technical with the original Greek and everything in it, but a very, very prolific book, almost 1,000 pages, right? I mean, I still remember that I used that.
A little over 700.
Okay, well, close enough. And, I've used that extensively in my postgrad studies as well. And what I really appreciate about your book is, and that's one of the reasons I want to speak to you specifically, because in your book and in your endeavors, in my friendship with you, there's something I really appreciate about you. And that is the fact that you really read the opposing material. You don't only just read the Christian apologetic stuff, you read the critics, You read, say for instance, Gerd Ludemann, you read John Dominic Crossan, you read Marcus Borg, you read the critics, Geza Vermeersch, and so forth and so on. And I really, really appreciate that, because I think if we want to really talk about faith in the public sphere, we have to be able to assimilate all the critic ideas. Otherwise, how do we then know that we have a faith based on historic evidence, sound historic principles? So my first question, Mike, would be, before we get into the hardcore historical issues, is what is your perception on the faith climate in the world and in your country at the moment? I really have a strong sense of the increasing secularization. There's of course a big debate: do we really get more secular, or do we get more spiritual? And maybe it's a little of both. But what's really true is that the critical unbelief is really increasing. In my view, that is. How do you view that? And in just on a general level, how did your historical studies help you to take a hold, or to actually face those doubts that we walk with today?
Well, I think your observation or your assessment of what's happening in the world today in terms of at least Western culture, I think it's spot on. Everything, the Western world has become increasingly secular and increasingly hostile to the Christian worldview. And it's because of the more of the Christian ethics, matters like abortion and same-sex marriage. The secular culture has wanted to promote these for some time. And of course, these go against the Christian ethic. And it's been Christianity that has been standing in the way. It's a powerful force for which the secular world has had to deal. So, but I don't know exactly how it is in South Africa, but I know here in the United States, the mainstream media is very secular and anti-Christian, and they're very powerful. Many people in our government, one party in particular, but both parties, but one party in particular, really promoting these anti-Christian ethics. So, yeah, I see it happening. I think probably persecution of Christians is in the not too distant future in the Western world. I mean, we already see some sorts of light persecution, but on college campuses and high school campuses here in the United States, where students are, they can receive a failing grade or be ostracized or bullied just because of their Christian views, because they're not buying into the secular standards and things that they're promoting. In terms of what my research has done to help my doubts, it has helped them a lot, because when you have this very strong secular, non-religious, atheistic push that goes against Christianity, it can be really powerful, and it has impacted our youth. The millennial generation is strongly impacted by it. They don't even know it, but of course they've been watching television all these years, and even your sitcoms, your comedy shows have just mocked the kind of Christian ethics. So they get used to that, and now they follow that. So when you're going against that kind of tide, things like fellowship with other believers is really important. Going to church in Western culture is more important now than perhaps it ever has been, because that fellowship with other believers is extremely important. That plus studying has shown me that Jesus did rise from the dead, has confirmed much of what we read in the Gospels and the New Testament. So yes, it has certainly helped me.
Okay. So if I understand, I don't know if you've read, Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, which is a really a monumental work, on our secular society at the moment. But the one thing that he says is that as secular thinking increases, all of us in the society walks around with what he calls a spontaneous secular imagination. And he by that he means not only secular people or atheists or agnostics walk with that. It's much easier in previous times before the Aufklärung. There has been the world has been enchanted with God's presence, and it was very easy to believe. But now things have turned way back to the other side, in the sense that the spontaneous imagination that all of us walk with today, in other words, the air that all of us breathe in every day is an atmosphere of skepticism and of doubt. Now, people respond differently to those things, and even within the church, I think, some people gravitate much more towards a fundamentalist kind of view. They actually want to just ignore everything, put their head in the sand and go on. Then you have the complete opposite. Some Christians are giving up their faith altogether. And then you have like two small streams in the middle. The one gravitates toward a more, I would say, progressive view of Christianity. Jesus was only human. He wasn't really divine. His resurrection was only meant to be seen as allegorical or symbolic. It's only a spiritual resurrection. I think of someone like Richard Carrier that would say that, although I think he doesn't even believe in the historicity of Jesus himself, but he said Paul's idea was a spiritual resurrection, right? And then we have perhaps a second stream, and within the middle, I mean, where Christians are really where some people really try to deal with the issues intellectually as well as spiritually, but they sort of get it right, I think, to still adhere to quite an orthodox view of the Bible. So sorry, what I want to ask you is, let's take the one stream that I mentioned, the more progressive kind of spirituality. People still want to hold on to Jesus, but they said that in a secular age, we can not just believe in resurrected people anymore, because science has shown us, that dead people don't rise, and therefore, so we have to adapt our theology to culture. What is your historical studies? A lot of what we believe as Christians rely on historical evidence. So do you think that's really necessary? If you just look at your own historical research, do we need to change our theology in such a way that we give away some of our main historical doctrines, like the physical resurrection of Jesus, like the deity of Christ? How do you deal with that from a historical perspective?
Well, it's interesting to note that C.S. Lewis dealt with this, years ago, decades ago. And we find it, I think he was doing it in his interviews on the BBC, and then we find it in his book, Mere Christianity, in what is called the Great Trilemma. And it's the Lord, Liar, Lunatic, what Josh McDowell later popularized it as. So we can establish that Jesus did claim to be God's uniquely divine son. I think we can do that historically. So Lewis went and he said, okay, well, he either was the Son of God or he wasn't. His claims were true or they were false. If they were false, he either knew that they were false or he didn't know it. If he didn't know it, that means he was a lunatic. A mind, a brain on the same level as a poached egg, he said. If he knew that they were false, then it makes him a liar. So a lot of these in progressive Christianity, they would say, well, Jesus was just a good teacher. He's a good man. Well, Lewis said that if Jesus was not who he claimed to be, the Son of God, Lord, he was either a lunatic or a liar. So you couldn't say he was a good teacher. He has not left that option open to us. Regarding what they say about, we can't believe in miracles, the laws of nature would militate against miracles like a resurrection occurring. I'd say these people just need to get out of their offices and spend some time in the world and talk to some people who've had experiences, because there are many people who have experienced miracles. And in fact, there are cases of people, even in the present day, who have been raised from the dead through prayer. Craig Keener talks about these in his 2-volume set, Miracles. And these are usually done by pastors, where you'll have stories about people in a tribe over in Africa or somewhere, and they don't know anything about Jesus, but they're opposing these Christians. And then something happens with, say, the witch doctor, and he ends up going to the pastor for help. The pastor prays, and the witch doctor gets healed. Or someone dies, and the pastor prays over them, and that person is raised from the dead. Or the blind receive sight. We've even heard about some answers to prayer miracles, even just this year. I'd encourage listeners to go online on YouTube and just do a search for Francis Chan. He left the United States and I think the San Francisco area and went over to Hong Kong, but he's been seeing some miracles. So that's pretty neat. In terms of the laws of nature, I'd say the laws of nature inform us of what typically occurs in our universe when it's left to itself. So take this marker here. I've got this marker. Now, if I drop this marker, it's going to fall because of the laws of nature. And I could do that a million times over and it's going to fall every time. Now, if I am holding it, put it up here and it's like, oh, I got it. Well, why didn't it fall? Well, because my hand entered the scene and altered the normal course of events. It was not left to itself. And in the same way, a miracle, it's not a violation of the laws of nature. It's not an exception to the laws of nature. It's when God's hand enters our universe in space-time and alters the natural course of events. That's what a miracle is. So again, whereas the laws of nature, they tell us what typically happens when the universe is left to itself, a miracle is when the universe was not left to itself. The laws of nature inform us that when a person dies, their corpse is not coming back to life by natural causes. That's what the laws of nature inform us. But it tells us nothing about whether God could raise someone from the dead. That has nothing to do with the laws of nature. And of course, the creator of the laws of nature can do what he wants with them.
When it comes to miracles, I think the book that you mentioned by Craig Keener was, to me, immensely helpful. His 2-volume works. And what's very cool to me is that I watched an interview with him where he talked about that. And he said it wasn't as though his faith was dependent on, all these miracles taking place all over the world, but he wanted to do a proper empirical study, good case studies. But what was very encouraging is that to see how involved God is actively in this world and how he protects his people. And so that was really very, very helpful to me. Let's just get back quickly to what you said about C.S. Lewis's trilemma idea. Because, of course, the whole trilemma assumes that, if those were really the words of Jesus, if he really spoke about himself the most, and he talked about himself as, as a God incarnate, you still have to assume that the biblical records are reliable, right? So just on a general plane, how reliable do you think the Gospels really are? And what would you say to people? I mean, some of the popular things that has been thrown around all the time is, the moment that something supernatural happens in the Gospel, that's mythology. We can't really have that. It's actually, I think, a resurrection of Rudolf Bultmann's idea of demythologizing. If something supernatural happens, it's mythology, and therefore the biblical Gospels are not really reliable. How would you respond to a opinion like that?
Well, in terms of the miracles, I'd just go back and say, people like Bultmann and so forth, they just needed to get out of their office and get out in the real world where they could talk with people who have experienced miracles, and get into some different countries. A lot of times miracles happen where the gospel is being forwarded for the first time. This is the way it happened in the New Testament. Miracles were there to typically done in order to bolster the credibility in the gospel message. So even Jesus himself, he said he forgave the sins of the paralytic in Mark chapter 2. And they did, they thought that was blasphemy. And you want me to heal this guy, huh? Okay, let me heal this guy so that you can see it'll be a sign that the Son of Man has authority on earth, even to forgive sins. So it's like the miracles are there to verify the teachings. And so miracles in these, let's say, third world countries where the dead are raised, where people are given, the blind are given sight, the deaf hear. It's so that the gospel will be received. And my guess is that many of these critics who just reject miracles just haven't opened their eyes, their spiritual eyes, you could say, or their worldview eyes. They haven't opened them to these kinds of things. But miracles are out there. Many Christians, I don't know about you, Rudolph, in your Christian life, but I would be willing to bet that in your time as a Christian, there's probably a handful of miracles you could discuss in which you have seen personally, or of others with credible testimonies of them. And most Christians who have been Christians for a few decades and have been grown in the faith have actually experienced miracles, true miracles. So that's what I would say about that. In terms of the credibility of the Gospels, well, there's a lot that could be said. And, it's a very broad question that you've asked. There's a lot of different objections, and there's not a single answer that covers them all. But I would say that even you don't have to believe that the Gospels are entirely reliable in order to learn certain things. Even the prominent skeptical New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman will acknowledge that there are a lot of things that we can learn in the Gospels. And a lot of us use certain criteria. They're common sense criteria that classicists and general historians who are outside the community of religious scholars that they would use. So if there's something that is attested by an eyewitness, that bears more weight than those that would not be attested by an eyewitness. Or something that would be rooted in eyewitness testimony would be something that would be more valuable than something else that was written 100, 150 years later. If it's attested in multiple independent sources, that weighs very heavily. If it's attested in an unsympathetic source. So for example, Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Mara bar Serapion, they all attest that Jesus was executed. It's Jesus' death by crucifixion. Even skeptical New Testament scholars will say is one of the most best attested facts of the ancient world. Now, it just so happens that Jesus' miracles are one of the best attested aspects of his life. It's in the earliest sources. It's in every layer of the gospel tradition. It's multiply attested. You even have Josephus mentioning that Jesus was a worker of amazing deeds in his Antiquities of the Jews. So that Jesus was known as a miracle worker is widely attested in the ancient world, even by unsympathetic sources. So there are numerous ways that we can get, even without establishing the overall historical reliability of the Gospels, there's still things that we can learn from the Gospels. That said, I do think the Gospels are historically reliable. I do have an article I've published. Those interested can go to my website, risenjesus.com, and go to the section on blogs and scroll down a little. And it's where I talk about the historical reliability of Mark versus Suetonius's life of Caesar Augustus.
Okay. So, Mike, when it comes to historical reliability, something you've just mentioned now several times is unsympathetic sources. I still remember when I read your first book on the resurrection, and I also read your second one, by the way, on the differences between the Gospels. Very, very helpful book. Thank you so much for that. And I don't even know of anybody that's really attempted that. And maybe someone has, but I don't know about the person. But we'll get to that shortly. What is the role in our epistemology, our historical epistemology? In other words, when we determine what can be historically accurate, what role does unsympathetic sources play in your determining whether history might be, whether a piece of literature might be historical or not?
Well, if you have, say, the Christians saying that Jesus died by crucifixion, someone could just say, well, the Christians believed in Jesus, they were biased, and we can't really trust that. But when you've got someone like Tacitus, who was hostile to the Christian faith, he called it a mischievous superstition and an evil. And he mentions Jesus's execution. That gives more credibility to it. I think we could think of a number of maybe contemporary examples. One that's just coming to my mind at the moment. We have a hot political race over here between President Trump and former Vice President Biden. And back in the early part of the year, President Trump stopped travel from Europe and China into the United States. And Biden said that he was xenophobic for doing that this was a big mistake. Well, later on, Biden acknowledged that Trump was right in doing it, and that Biden himself had been wrong. So here you've got like an unsympathetic, even a hostile source, Biden being hostile toward Trump, that acknowledging that Trump was right to do what he did at that time. So when you have an unsympathetic source who's saying that, well, then we could say, all right, Trump was right in stopping the travel from China and from Europe into the States back in the early year to stem the tide of COVID coming into the U.S. So that could be an example of that. When you have your political opponents agreeing with you on something that you're claiming, then that has a pretty good likelihood what you're claiming of being true. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. It makes perfect sense. I also think of the Jewish Talmud, who calls Jesus a very skilled sorcerer, because they acknowledge that he did miracles. But of course, sorcery was a very negative thing in those days, so they wouldn't acknowledge him as a miracle worker. But at least they acknowledge that he did, that he was a sorcerer. Okay, so Mike, thank you so much. But I think the miracles, most of even the skeptic scholars, I think that I know at least, again, Crossan, Borg, and those guys, I don't know what Bart Ehrman teaches on this, but most of them will acknowledge that Jesus at least did miracles. Maybe not the profound nature miracles like walking on water or calming the storm, but at least the healings and so on they would accept. But let's talk about the big one, the one that you wrote your thesis on, the resurrection. And let's just first start by what Marcus Borg says, that is it really necessary for us as Orthodox Christians to believe in the physical bodily resurrection? Because he claims to say, or he claims that if Jesus might not have risen physically necessarily, but we can still believe in what the resurrection story means. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's necessary that we should believe in a bodily historical resurrection?
Well, that is a great question. Rudolph, the older I get, the more I study these things, the less certain I become of some things. It's like, all right, what's necessary? What all is necessary to believe in order to be saved? And I probably, when I was in my mid-20s, I would have put more on that list than I put now. And it's not that I don't believe those things that I believed when I was 20, in my mid-20s. It's I may have softened in thinking, well, do you need to believe this in order to be a Christian? So if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but you don't believe that he rose bodily, can you still be a Christian? And I don't know. I would think you probably could, but the bodily resurrection is extremely important. Do you have to believe it to call yourself a Christian? Or I don't know how God's going to judge on that, and God will have to judge on that. Mike Licona isn't going to. But I would say that the bodily resurrection, the physical resurrection of the transformation of Jesus's corpse, is clearly taught in the New Testament. It is crystal clear in all four Gospels. And I think that Paul is fairly clear on it. Yes, there are some texts that have been debated by scholars over time. I've wrestled with those texts, And I don't think that there really is any legitimate reason for thinking that the Christians thought of Jesus's resurrection in a sense anything other than the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, this is the chapter that throws some of the rather skeptical stripe of scholars off. Paul opens up by saying, I want to preach the gospel message to you. And he talks about the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances. Then you get to verse 20, and he says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised in the general resurrection. He's the first to be raised in a resurrection body. When are the rest going to be raised? Well, Paul answers that 3 verses later in verse 23. He says, Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. So in other words, Jesus was raised back in the first century, and then we're going to be raised when he comes back, when he returns during his second coming. Well, what happens to us in the meantime? Well, in 2 Corinthians 5:8, Paul says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And in Philippians chapter 1, I believe it's verse 22, he talks about how he can die and be with Christ or remain on in the flesh, in the body. So Paul thinks about in terms of when a person dies, their spirit leaves their body and goes to be with Christ immediately. There's no soul sleep. They are with Christ immediately. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And Paul's statement in Philippians 1:22 makes no sense if there was a soul sleep. It makes perfect sense if the person is going to be with Jesus immediately. And then remember Jesus, when he talks to the thief on the cross in Luke, he says, today you will be with me in paradise. So then one more passage here, 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, Paul says to the believers there in Thessalonica, he says, I don't want you to grieve as those who do not have hope, because Christ will bring with him those who have died as believers. So the spirits of those who die as Christians are going to return with Christ at his second coming. And then he says, the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. If they're coming back with Paul, how is it that the dead in Christ are going to be raised first? Well, that's simple. Jesus is bringing the spirits of the dead back with him, and then they're going to be reunited with their corpses, which are going to be resurrected and then transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. So it is a bodily resurrection, physical resurrection of the corpse, just like all 4 Gospels talk about. And in 1 Corinthians 15, one final thing here is Paul is answering their question because they're having some opponents tell them that there is no resurrection, that this life is all there is. And so Paul answers that with the basic argument that says, if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised because it's all part of the general resurrection. And if we're not going to be raised, then the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. That argument makes no sense unless Paul really means, and the earliest Christians, they truly meant that Jesus was actually raised from the dead. And we can see from Paul's writings and from the Gospels that by resurrection, they meant that it involved the corpse. It was a bodily resurrection.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I really agree with your fact. It's my experience as well that as we get older, it's as though we live in concentric circles. We have the core of the faith, the core of the gospel that is fairly large, and then we have a bigger gray area in which you don't necessarily have to believe all those things to be a Christian. And as I grow older, the inner core becomes smaller, but it's still there. One of the things that I would say concerning the, do you have to believe in the bodily resurrection is, well, let me state it this way. From a philosophical point of view, I would think it'd be important to believe in a bodily resurrection because it doesn't make sense to me to think that we're allowed or it's intellectually legitimate to believe in what the resurrection means if the resurrection didn't really become part of historical reality. How do we then know, that it's really a legitimate belief to hold on to? So, okay.
I agree with you, Rudolph. I think the bodily resurrection is important. I think it's very important. All I was just saying is if someone believed that Jesus was actually raised from the dead, but they thought he was raised spiritually rather than bodily, would that exclude them from eternal life? And, I just am hesitant to say that is a gospel essential. But I understand its importance in both theology and in practice. It's extremely important. And I think it's clearly taught in the New Testament.
Well, friends, I think you would agree with me that there are such a lot to think about concerning our historical roots and the roots of our Christian faith. But the time is just caught up with us. So next time we'll really get into some depth concerning some specific objections when it comes to historical claims and the Christian faith. God bless you all.